And now to today's program and today's speaker. You can learn something about today's speaker, Kathleen Saadat, on her telephone without ever talking to her. Yesterday, I called to talk to her about her introduction for today's presentation, but I missed her and got her voicemail instead. On her recording, before she asks you to leave a message, she relates a story that I think tells you a good deal of where Kathleen Saadat is coming from. It goes like this. An old rabbi once asked his people how they could tell when the night had ended and the day had begun. One replied, "Is it when you see an animal in the distance and tell whether it's a sheep or a dog?" "No," answered the rabbi. Another then asked, "Is it when you can tell whether a tree is a fig tree or a peach tree?" "No, that's not it either," answered the rabbi. So the people asked the rabbi, "Then when is it?" And the rabbi answered, "It's when you can look on the face of any man or woman and see whether they are your sister or your brother. If you cannot see, then it's still night." Kathleen Saadat has long been active in this community on issues of human diversity and race relations. She is currently a consultant and trainer in these fields and program director for the Women's Multicultural Leadership Institute, which is under development at the Sophia Center in Marylhurst, Oregon. The Saadat served as former Governor Neil Goldschmidt's Director of Affirmative Action, and more recently as Commissioner's Assistant to Commissioner Gretchen Kafori on the Portland City Council. Before those experiences, Kathleen managed the Youth Services arm of Portland Urban League and was executive director of the Oregon Commission on Black Affairs. She's the recipient of multiple awards for her work, including the 1992 Bayard Rustin Civil Rights Award presented by the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, and a 1991 Woman of Achievement Award from Oregon State University. She was cited last year by Oregon Business Magazine as one of its list of 100 who lead in Oregon. Saadat was born and raised in the Midwest and moved to Oregon in 1970. She holds a degree in psychology from Reed College. Kathleen tells us that her favorite things to do are read, play big boggle, and racquetball. If there's time after her speech, I intend to ask her to explain to us how to play big boggle. But for now, I would ask you to join me in welcoming Kathleen Saadat to the City Club podium.
Thank you, Don. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good to know you're here. When Joanne asked me if I would be a presenter today, she asked me the title of the presentation, and I said, Black History is Your History. And yesterday when I was listening to the radio, I heard the title was Black History is Our History. And I want to be real clear. Ultimately, I want us to get to the place where Black history is our history, but I think it's important that you recognize that I already know Black history is my history. Now, the idea for the title comes from hearing Brian Lanker speak in Eugene some years ago. It was a reception for his I Dream a World exhibit. The exhibit photographs that he took of black women who made a difference in this country. He had invited Merle Evans, Medgar Evans' widow, and Ernestine Anderson, jazz singer, and we were all having a lovely time in this very lovely setting. And at some point, he went up on the stairway to speak to us. As he stood on that staircase, he talked about meeting his subjects and getting to know them. And the thing that he said that really stood out for me was, I started out to do a book about black history, and found that I was doing a book about my history. I was standing with two young people, African-American people in their 20s, children of a friend, and I said, listen to him. I have never heard a white man acknowledge or own black history as part of his history. I was very moved by what I heard. From that day to this, I've wondered what it might mean to have everyone in this country accept as important all of the histories of all of the diverse groups that are America. I've also wondered what it means that we haven't done this, that we seem hell-bent on not taking a step that would help heal this country. I have an African-American friend who hates Black History Month. She thinks it tokenizes us. She feels that the history of women, black people, and other people of color should be respectfully placed into any history taught in America. I feel both ways. I feel like we need Black History Month to help push for that history being included into the history of America. I think that we have a history of denying that we have a history together. That's our history. We say this is separate. So we still need Black History Month. It's also the case that Black History Month is not only a catalyst for respecting and celebrating the history of African Americans. Black History Month also acts as a catalyst for others to remember and celebrate their heritage. And some years ago, at one of the high schools here in Portland, they used to take the month and divide it up into 4 weeks, and each one of those weeks was a celebration. 1 week for American Indians, 1 week for Asian Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And I hope they're still doing it, because I think it's important that we begin to acknowledge all those histories. Black people in America were a major force in the economic development of this nation. The enslavement and sometimes murder of members of the African American community and the exploitation and murder of members of other groups is a significant part of what enabled America to become a world power. The failure to recognize, respect, and incorporate this information into our social, political, and economic consciousness is at the core of the ongoing and unresolved racial conflict in America. The failure to recognize, respect, and incorporate Black history as vital to the development of America leaves a historical vacuum, easily claimed and filled by the David Dukes and Khalid Muhammads of our country. And incidentally, I want to point something out about Mr. Muhammad. I'm sure that you heard about his vitriolic attack on a number of groups. He also assaulted black people in his presentation at Keene College. Everyone from Alice Walker to Nelson Mandela. He assaulted Jesse Jackson, Cornel West, and Bayard Rustin. And here's another aside. Bayard Rustin was a black gay man who helped organize the March on Washington, at which Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Mr. Muhammad attacked African Americans. And it doesn't surprise me that he did so, but what's intriguing is that the press did not include African Americans among the list of people that he attacked. I wonder why. The failure to recognize, respect, and incorporate the histories and the contributions of the diverse groups of people who make up America has left a vacuum easily filled with suspicion and hatred, lies and half-truths, which help perpetuate the traditions of bigotry. And I'm saying the traditions of bigotry. Traditions is a carefully chosen word. Bigotry is not genetic. Bigotry is related to our belief, in our self-righteous belief, that it's okay to attack other people given certain circumstances. And you hear people say, well, the reason we have a rise in racism is because the economy of the country is shaky. No, the reason we have a rise in racism is we believe that a shaky economy gives us the right to attack other people. I think it's important that we're real clear on that. Sometimes that vacuum is filled with anti-Semitic vitriol. Now, right here in Oregon, in rural Lane County, there was a recent effort to recall the chair of a school board there. And some of the people who were supporting that recall were knocking on doors and asking people to support the recall and ask them, "You know she's a Jew, don't you?" Sometimes that vacuum is filled with what seems to be self-defeating arrogance. For example, while many of the children in the rest of the world are trying to learn to speak more than one language, there are Americans who are busy trying to pass English-only laws. This seems the ultimate in self-defeat as we move into a global consciousness and a global need to recognize where we are on the globe. The vacuum created by our unacknowledged histories sucks into itself lies about realities and relationships and spews out lies about human beings. In Oregon, they have recently manifested themselves in the Measure 9 initiative, an attack on lesbians and gay men, an attack on democracy, and an attack on the religious freedoms of everyone except the Oregon Citizens Alliance. As long as we leave these giant holes in history, the vacuum is available to any hate monger who may make us want to doubt what we can accomplish together. Audre Lorde was a friend. She was a black, lesbian, feminist poet who died last year. And in her book, Sister Outsider, she talks about why we reject differences. She wrote, "Institutionalized rejection of differences is an absolute necessity in a profit economy which needs outsiders as surplus people. As members of such an economy, we have all been programmed to respond to the human differences between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways. Ignore it, and if that's not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it's subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in the service of separation and confusion." All she's saying is we don't have a model for working together. And I guess I'm here today to say we need to be that model. We need to figure it out. And a part of coming closer together as a nation means we must all look at black history as our history. And we must all look at the histories of the diverse people that make up America as our history. I'm not just talking to white people here. I'm talking to all of us. The respect is needed between and among all groups. I want to back up. Let's talk about what is the importance of history. When you look in the dictionary, history is defined as a narrative of events, a story, a chronological record of events, the branch of knowledge that records and analyzes past events. The historian is a person who keeps the record. What the dictionary does not say is that the historian is recording from his or her own point of view and from his or her own ideological perspective. Another interesting dictionary point is the distinction between what is historical and what is historic. Historical is whatever happened in the past, whether it was regarded as important or not, while historic describes what is important in history. One might say that the problem with our history is everybody got to be historical, but only some people got to be historic. Some people would ask, who cares what happened in the past, and why can't we just start with today and move forward? What's the big deal? The big deal is that our histories help to tell us who we are, who we've been, and to some extent, who we might be, who we might expect to be. The need to claim and know our history is part of why children will ask you to tell me about that time when, and when you were little, and what about me when I was little. They like to hear stories about when they were younger. This need to claim history is why we keep pictures of our grandparents and treasures that are otherwise not important, mementos, brooches that belong to some long-dead relative. The stories and images are our history. We embrace the people, even if we did not know them. They are the reason that we are here. Our parents and their parents and their parents, consciously or unconsciously, set the direction of the path we walk today. By what they did or did not do, they help shape today's attitudes, institutions, and systems. The story of our relationships with one another is our history, whether we're talking about stories in a family, a community, a state, or a nation. The story of our relationships with one another is our shared history, our common history, whether we're talking about gender, race, sexual orientation, age, ability, or any of the other characteristics we think of when we think of human diversity. Now, if we were social workers reviewing the history, and another use of the word history, that is what has happened in a family, where there's a constant conflict, poor communication, abuse, violence, grief, and fear, and a denial of all the above, we would call that family dysfunctional. We would base our conclusion partially on the realization that the family was in trouble and seemed unable to work it through. We would base it partially on the realization that they were in denial. And we could see that the denial gets in the way of healing. The failure of family members to own and act responsibly to solve the problems gets in the way of the healing. This family, this America in which you and I live, is dysfunctional. I believe we're having trouble in part because we're either unwilling or unable to own our common history. Now, I'm not proposing that owning common history is going to solve everything, but I am saying it's a big step. It's a big step to say, yes, this is what happened. I'm not asking anybody to crawl into a shell of guilt or to be so overwhelmed by the reality that they're paralyzed. The point is to own it so that we can move forward. I believe we're having trouble because we won't own that common history. And what's true is many white people are unwilling to recognize the consequences of that history and to acknowledge that they benefited from the relationships of the past and continue to do so today. I was doing a training up in Seattle a while ago, and a young man said to me, I'm a supervisor, a young white man, and he was having problems with an employee, and the employee would say to him, a black employee, I can't talk to you. Your people enslaved my people. And he said to me, when he says that, what should I say? And I said, the first thing you need to say is, you're right. The second thing you need to say is, and I benefited from that. And the third thing is, and now what can we do together to move forward? How can I use the benefits that I've acquired to make a difference? At the same time, I'm not speaking only to white people here. I'm also speaking to men, to heterosexuals, to Protestants, regardless of color, and to the able-bodied, and the fairer-skinned people within some racial groups. And I'm going to say that as complicated as this whole thing is, it gets even more complicated when you go within the groups and you find the same kind of divisiveness around skin color. To make the point another way about the history of people of color in America, if you took us all away, what would be left? How would this America have come into existence? Whose land was taken? Whose lives diminished in the process of building America? Who worked the cane fields and built the railroads? Who planted, picked, and ginned the cotton so that it could be king? Who cleaned the houses and cared for the children, shoed the horses, carried the water, picked the fruit and vegetables? The history of the development of this nation is the history of the Indians, Mexicans, Africans, Asians, and yes, the British, Irish, Scots, Swedes, Poles, etc. Together in this country, we have all had a relationship. For better or for worse, we share in what is the history of this country. But at the same time that we have shared that history, some groups' accomplishments are seen as historical and others as historic. When we start to talk to each other about history, it's important to recognize that one man's ceiling is another man's floor. And I'm going to use as an example something that happened here in Portland some years ago. It was Gay Pride, and we're having a big march. And a young man showed up at Portland's Gay Pride March, dressed as Aunt Jemima, and he had on blackface. And as he began to come into the parade, a young black woman who was a monitor said, "Who are you supposed to be?" And he said to her, "You ought to know." She said, "Wash your face or leave the parade." The initial reaction from other people in the parade was to separate her out, thinking she was attacking him. And finally, people got it, that he was behaving inappropriately, and he was shushed from the parade with people chanting, "Racism is not fun." Now, for the following year, the year following that, we had a great long dialogue in the gay press. And some people saw it as an issue of First Amendment rights. The African-American respondents acknowledged his right to dress as he chose, but pointed out that we have a right to be angry about it. Ultimately, the African-Americans tried to explain that Aunt Jemima to some people, white people, might appear a symbol of love and comfort, and at the same time a symbol of oppression, ridicule, and grief to African Americans. And you know, we have a more recent example in the form of Ted Danson and the Whoopi Goldberg experience here, with somebody deciding it's okay to come out in blackface, and apparent shock at the responses. For some people it's fun, for other people it's not. And yes, you have a right to do it. But the question is getting beyond talking always about what our rights are, and to talk about our responsibilities as we try to build a different world, a different model for survival in America. We can argue rights all we want. That's not all that it takes to enable us to be able to live together and to get along. As a matter of fact, sometimes it seems to divide us even more. We have to work to gain better understanding of our histories and the worldview that has come from them. And when I say worldview and the fact that they're different, you know, when Irma Gonzalez and I went to see one of the Spike Lee movies, I think it was Do the Right Thing, you could tell where all the black people were sitting, because they were laughing at places that was different from the place that all the white people were laughing. And what you experience in life shapes the way that you see the world. It is also true that for white people to accept the reality of the other histories, you will have to see the building of America from the point of view of those who made major contributions to building this nation and have received little or no benefit and scant recognition. I think that acceptance might make it a little more difficult to continue to enjoy those benefits and the privileges with a sense of entitlement and gusto. I think it's a hard move to make, to say we did the thing we thought we should do, and it had this impact. And the people who were the recipients of the impact still live here with us, and they have an opinion. And all I'm saying today is it's time to listen. It's time to take a good look at the divisions in America and work harder to heal them. Identity politics was a necessary part of what we've gone through in the last 20 years. We needed to go through it. We needed to name ourselves. The groups that felt disenfranchised and marginalized needed to name ourselves and to put pressure on a system that has not served us. It's also the case that if we cannot find a way to coalesce for our own greater good, we, including each of the groups that has been marginalized by what we call the system being us, ultimately, we are going to lose any of the gains for which we've worked. We're going to lose all the gains for which we've worked. And if we all intend to stay together as America, then the requirement we must all meet is to change. And I'll say that change is not simple. James Baldwin in Nobody Knows My Name said, "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one identity." A lot of times we say, well, he doesn't want to change because he's just a bigot. Well, if part of his definition of himself is bigot, then you're right, because to change means he has to go through a time of not knowing who he is. And that's real scary for anybody. And as you read the books on organizational change, they'll tell you that a good manager has to get people through that time when the old rules are gone and the new rules have not yet been put into place or enforced. So as we go through that change, one of the things we have to remember is why we're making the change in order to get through the scary times. This change means letting go of the old ways of seeing ourselves, such as perpetrator and victim. Shelby Steele wrote a piece that said, "I'm black, you're white, who's guilty?" I think everybody should read it. There's some presuppositions that we can carry perhaps about groups and some knowledge we carry about dynamics, but maybe we should let them go when we get to individuals and trying to interact with one another. It is not automatic that you feel any particular way about me. And so ultimately what we're trying to get to is interacting as individuals and not as one-dimensional representatives of groups. So if I'm in an all-black group, then I feel like a lesbian. And if I'm in an all-white group, I feel like an African American. And if I'm in a group of all men, I feel like a woman. I'm more than that. I'm all those, and I'm some more. And it's time for us to start talking about that wholeness, that whole human being. And that will take us to the issue of the greater good. It means finding new ways of thinking in different language, such as tossing out the word inclusion and using the word collaborate when you want me to work with you on something. I don't want to be included in this big thing that's going to change the world after you figured out how to do it and you want me to take on a task. Let's talk about it together. Let's collaborate. This change means to quit denying that in our lifetime we are at risk of losing our democracy. Now, if you haven't gotten that yet and you live through Measure 9, take another look. We are threatened with some people who are now in 40 out of 50 states trying to change the way in which we govern ourselves, trying to exclude from the process by law people they decide aren't okay. First step. The second and most insidious part is they remove the right to try to regain human status. Measure 9 was dangerous. And I just came back from D.C. with a meeting of 11 other states where there's a very active campaign on the same level. And you know that these same people are involved in running stealth candidates for school boards. The issue of censorship is relevant to them. Taxation, schools. We're looking at an effort to change the way we govern ourselves and to remove the possibilities of America. And if you haven't seen that, look again. The change I'm talking about means telling ourselves and our children the truth about our history, their history, and helping them find new ways to be. Makes you wonder what the world would be like if the children today had had good education, not just about what happened in our country, but sort of world history. I remember being in high school in Chicago at Farragut High on the west side, and it was a world history class, right? And they're talking Europe, and they're talking a little bit of China, and they're talking a lot of America, and I'm saying, okay, what's going on here at the same time? And the teacher can't tell me. This is world history class. He cannot tell me what's going on in Africa. He can't tell me anything about South America. Well, what would the world be like if we'd had a different kind of history to teach our children? Not so much one-sided, not so much the conqueror, the dominant theory of history, where if you win the war, you are therefore superior. What if we had another way of talking about all this? May be hard to conceptualize now, but I think it's what we need to work on. We cannot continue to live in this country with its violence. 10,000 people murdered last year with handguns, 10,000. Other countries have figures like 12, 5, 50. We cannot survive without talking about violence and the fact that we permit, allow, and think it's okay, and that a lot of our discussions are not about ending violence, but about the degree to which violence is acceptable. It all links up together for me. I'm going to close with a James Baldwin quote. For the sake of one's children, in order to minimize the bill they must pay, one must be careful not to take refuge in any delusion. And the value placed on the color of the skin is always and everywhere and forever a delusion. I know that what I'm asking is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand. And one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general, and American Negro history in particular, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. And here we are at the center of the arc, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. The fire next time. Black history is your history.
Thank you, Kathleen. Now it's time for questions from the audience for City Club members. The microphone, as you see, has been placed in the center of the room. Please make your questions as brief as possible so that there'll be time for a number of questions, we hope, from the audience today. Again, the first question comes from Susan Stone, member of the board.
Kathleen, one of the results we've seen since Measure 5 is the cutbacks of programs and the grappling parents are going through and the attempt to put kids in private schools for those parents that can afford it. What are we going to do to prevent this from becoming even more of a class society than we already have?
Well, I guess there are a lot of answers to that for me. We need to talk more about class and what it means. We don't talk about class in this country. We talk about race. And even within racial groups, there are divisions along class lines. We need to talk about what it means to end up with a two-layered society. I think we need to regroup and recognize the value of education. I think we're going to have to come up with some money. Frankly, People don't want to hear it. People think that there are bones buried deep somewhere else. By the time we find those bones, or by the time there's an impetus to find those bones, we've got a whole bunch of kids who have suffered without education. You know, if I had a child and I could afford to put it in a private school because I thought the public schools were not doing its job, then I probably would do it. At the same time, I recognize that people abandoning the public schools doesn't help the country. It simply doesn't. What it says is that there'll be this continued and ongoing strife between groups of people. Some will perceive it as racial, some will perceive it as gender, some will perceive it as something else. A lot will see that it's money. And since most of the people who are in the people of color groups, or a lot of us, tend to be at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, you have to put race back in there. You can't take it out. Ultimately, I think we need to revamp the whole system, which is what I talk about a lot, and start talking about what do we need as a nation to survive in a global economy, a global market, a world where children are going to need more and more to have greater knowledge in order to get and keep jobs. People don't like the idea of I think, more taxes. I'm not going to argue that there should be more taxes, maybe that we should do it differently. I think that the federal government is often responsible for assigning programs. I know that they are often responsible for assigning programs to states without revenue. And so the states have to come up with those monies to carry out mandated programs. Maybe we need to look at that. And of course, I think that anything spent on the war machine is unjustifiable. You know, even on the issue of gays in the military, it was hard for me because I don't believe anybody should be in the military. So I don't have any real concrete answers except that we need to recognize that this is an issue of class. And as we move toward a greater division, we move toward a more rapid destruction of our country. And we're tossing out the ideals that we've had for so long and for which we've worked for so long.
Kathleen, we have, you and I and a lot of other folks have been working at this and trying to get this approach across to people for years. For decades. And yet there are times when you feel as though you haven't gotten very far at all, where there are you continue to run against the same sort of problems. How do you continue, and what is your next step?
Well, one thing I have to do is remind myself. I'm standing in front of the City Club in Portland, Oregon. And when I was a little kid, that wouldn't have happened. I have to remind myself that there has been movement. I think maybe it's time for me to stop answering some questions. I watched Bill Cosby the other night on a program called Violence in America. And there were some things that just jumped out at me. One was that everybody on the stage was black except for Janet Reno and what's his name? The guy who does Larry King. Now, how can you do a program called Violence in America with everybody on the stage being black? I wonder what that means. King asked Bill Cosby was talking about unemployment and how the change in the demographics, racial demographics, is related to the rate of unemployment. And King says, do you think that has to do with race and racism? And Cosby said, you live in America. I'm not going to answer that question. I thought, right on, Bill Cosby. You know, it's like, sometimes it's like letting people believe they have a position because you argue with them. And when you stop arguing, they get it. And some days I just decide I'm not going to argue. Maybe that's one of the next steps we need to look at. One of the other things, you know, Derek Bell talks about the permanence of racism. He thinks it's not going to go away. Well, I certainly think it's not going to go away in my lifetime. So I want to minimize the degree to which I respond to it, if I possibly can. One of the best lessons I ever learned was walking across 21st Avenue in Portland, northeast Portland. This is some time ago. And I saw some men coming down the street, about 6 or 7 men. They had on silk shirts and bracelets, and they were having a great time. And I said, that's a group of gay men. They were all black. They headed toward 21st, and as they got to the corner, a white pickup came along and had to stop for the light so they could cross. There was a man in the truck screaming pejoratives at them. No, non-racial, but all about their sexual orientation. And these guys kept walking across the street. And I said, Kathleen, stop. There's something you got to learn here. Something's going on. These guys have not pulled this guy out of the truck window and beaten him up. They're just going on having a good time. And the guy in the truck actually put his body out over the top of the cab and screamed at them. Then the light changed, the truck drove off, and he's still screaming, and these guys go into 7-Eleven. I said, you got to go into 7-Eleven, you got to figure out what's going on. I walked in. These men are in the store holding out their money in their hand, pointing to what they want because they don't speak English. See, what does this mean if you don't respond? I said, aha, now, if they'd spoken English, they would have drugged this guy out of the truck, beat him up, and they'd all be in jail. This way they can go downtown and go dancing like they'd originally intended. Don't speak the language. Eleanor Roosevelt said it doesn't matter what they call you, it matters what you answer to. Quit answering to the pejoratives. Wonder who they're talking to. Oh, and Lou, I believe in organizing all the time.
Bob McMenamin, member. Kathleen, you find a number of whites who disagree with blacks and some vice versa. What do the studies show that perhaps what percentage of those whites are partially black and what percentage of those blacks are perhaps partially white?
I don't know, but Oprah did a show the other day that I'm sorry I missed. And I don't know what the data showed, but I've always, kind of walked around in my life and looked at people and said, they don't even know. And we do know that most African Americans have both white, that is European blood, and Native American blood. But what a lot of people don't know is the mix is just so much there because we respond to the artificial nature of the issue of race. It's like been created, and we all respond to it on some level.
Gail Johnson, City Club member. I went to hear Betty Shabazz the other day, the widow of Malcolm X, and I was delighted to hear her explain Malcolm's statement, by any means necessary, and she gave a whole different perspective to it that I think encompasses a little bit about what we're talking about today. Her explanation for that statement was that, first of all, it had been totally misunderstood. Mm-hmm. Malcolm meant that we needed to use everything that was available to us, the political system, the educational system, all of those things, whatever would make change. How do you see us using these various aspects of our culture, of America, in being able to make the changes that we need to make now?
You know, one of the things, Gail, first of all, I believe that the basic change begins in yourself. Your heart has to change. It has to shift. It has to say, this is important. It has to say, I'm going to learn this thing. It has to say, I'm going to feel lost for a while, and it's okay for me to be ignorant, uninformed. It's okay for me to learn. Another probably unpopular idea in the 90s is the idea of volunteerism. Some people don't like that idea. They feel like we're supposed to get paid for everything. I went to, when I was a kid, Floretta Howard's School of Expression. This was a little place in St. Louis that was run by an ex-school teacher. And she had no government grants. And since my family was poor, they really couldn't give her a lot of money to support that school. But like 3 days a week after school, we went over and we learned how to speak correctly. And that's where I learned poor old Jonathan Bing went out in the carriage to visit the king, group poetry, and some kind of just discussion on life. This was not a federally funded program. This was somebody in the neighborhood who said, I'm going to do this for these kids. And it's paid off. We don't do enough of that now. And it's called personal responsibility. And personal responsibility means running for the school board. It means dialoguing with the officials. It means taking the time to think about what you think will make things better and then talking to other people about what they think and coming up with something to take somewhere to make a difference. You know, the right wing has a prayer that says, and I read this somewhere, says, Dear God, forgive us. We know we've been remiss in not getting onto boards, commissions, and school boards. Well, if we back away, then we give up power. And I think ultimately what we're talking about is personal responsibility for making a difference in our sphere of influence. Taking a stand, not leaving it to somebody else.
David Brownell, City Club member. A white friend of mine, a professor of history in Eugene, told me a while ago that one of the largest voids in his department, so he thought, was qualified black history professors. Would you agree that the extent to which black history is not yet our history is due to that void? And if so, do you think the void is lessening?
I think the void is created by using the word qualified in front of the word black. You know, my ears just go, huh? I don't hear that when they talk about white history professors. That's part of the void. Another part is like differences in how people are in terms of their own culture. And I think it'd be very hard to live in Eugene unless you'd been there a long time already. But it's like any kind of small town, you know. If you were born and raised there, you're more comfortable. When I was working for Neil, and I used to talk to the schools about recruiting, I would ask them what they had to offer outside of money, because money's not the big draw here. And I don't think that a lot of those people recognize that there are African Americans and Hispanics and Asians who like to fish, who like to be in the outdoors, who are concerned about where they raise their children. And so they give up before they even try to start selling Oregon. But I think the biggest problem is the question of using the word qualified whenever we talk about a person of color or a woman, because it already has set the stage for the possibilities of success.
Kathleen, Robert Smith, member of the club. Could you discuss being politically correct in the controversy about that? You did not mention it, probably deliberately, but would you like to comment on that?
Oh, God. I really, sometimes I don't know what it means. Sometimes it's a knowledge, I have a knowledge that people are trying to change the language in order to help change behavior. We have, what people hang on to a lot is First Amendment rights, the right to say anything you want. And again, I think we need to look at that right in light of the consequences of exercising that right. When you talk about using the right name for a group of people, for instance, when I was little, I was colored, then I got to be a Negro, that was a big deal. And then I got to be black, and now I'm African American, and in a minute I'll be an American of African descent. All of that is okay with me. And if somebody, especially some older white person, calls me colored, I just don't get upset. That's nicer than a lot of things they were calling us in the 40s. Language is important, and I would never say it isn't. It's incredibly important. But it's not so important that you have to overlook the core of what's being said. If the intent of the person is clear, and the intent is to build unity, then, talk to them later about the language. But then, here I am. I go one place and people say, don't say Hispanic. I go somewhere else and they say, don't use the word Latino. And somewhere else they're saying, we are Chicanas. I don't know what to do. So I understand the dilemma. As times change, then language changes. And we have to be conscious of that change in language, and we have to be as respectful as possible. But at the same time, we have to not stop progress so that everybody speaks the same language. Because the language we speak today will not be the same next week.
Joanne Allen, City Club member. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, Joanne.
On the same subject, basically, I know when I moved to Portland, to Oregon 3 years ago, it shocked me the first time somebody referred to me as a minority, because I'd never in my life considered myself a minority, and I'd never lived in a location where anyone had ever addressed me as such. And I've gotten better about reacting to that terminology, but I would like you to comment on the term minority and what the implication is just based on using that terminology.
Well, you know, there are lots of different ways to look at that, too. Minority means numerically less than. It does not mean intellectually inferior. It does not mean spiritually compromised. It does not mean that you're bad people when you're numerically inferior. That is a lesser number. What we've done with the language, however, is use it to mean just the things I said it didn't mean. And I think that's the reaction to the use of the term. So now we move to people of color. And I run into people all the time who don't like that term. Don't mush me in with all those other people. Well, I'm not sure what we're going to be satisfied with, but I think it's healthy to keep exploring. I don't have a reaction to the term minority in the way that a lot of people do, because I still see it as that technical dictionary definition. At the same time, I'm aware of the fact that that's not how people use it. And when I watch the dialogue between the gay and lesbian community and some of the people of color communities, and the gay and lesbian community is not sure whether it wants to call itself a minority, but the OCA is saying it's going for minority status. It makes clear both the racism in the OCA's agenda and the fact that we have manipulated the language into being something that it didn't mean originally.
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
You mentioned the importance of language, and increasingly the visual is important as well, and you mentioned Spike Lee in your speech. What's the influence today, and what would you expect the influence in the near term of his films, of Boys in the Hood, of Menace Society 2, the statements that are being made by black filmmakers now in terms of our history, as you point out?
You know, I like Spike Lee. I think he's qualitatively different, and what he produces is a lot different from the other films that you've named. The other films have given me a sense of hopelessness. Spike Lee challenges me to think. And in that sense, I hope that he continues to make films, and that sometime, some way, somebody recognizes what excellent films he makes. Boys in the Hood tells a story. Menace to Society tells a story. The story of colors. You know, those are all things that are happening. And maybe people need to know about them. But what I think it does sometimes is reinforce the young people into glamorizing. But that's not the problem, really. The problem is if you are having trouble with the media, if you're having trouble with movies, and you have children, how come we can't stop them from going to these things? See, it's the same, like, why am I sending my children off to see this movie that glamorizes murder? But then why am I sending them off to see any movie that glamorizes murder? All you did was take a subset of an already violent country and say, and this is what, in the context of the hood, is happening. Now, nobody has that same response when it's Sylvester Stallone mowing people down. That's just mowing people down. I think part of why we're concerned about it, however, realistically, is because in the hood there is anger. And there is anger at the overall society. And I think it titillates some people to see that anger, and sometimes to feel the threat of that anger and not live in the hood. I think it relieves people of some responsibility sometime to go see a film like that and say, oh God, that's awful, let's go talk about it, and still not do anything. I think that the media, the films, the radio, the television are some of the most influential things in our lives right now, and we don't have any control. We refuse to exert control over them. It's not that we don't have any control, it's we refuse to exert that control. And your parents saying, well, I can't stop them from looking at the television. I said, what you do is you reach over and you turn it off. Why are we going to the discussion of censorship? Censorship starts right here. You turn it off. My father would walk in and say, turn that thing off. And if you took too long, he would say, did you hear what I said? Which meant you had about 10 seconds to get it off and out of the house. The dialogue we're having now is about loss of control or a sense of responsibility or a sense that we know better than the children. I think The Boys in the Hood was a good film for me to see. It was a good film. So was Menace to Society, but it grieved me. And I said, yeah, that's going on. What can I do about it? How do I help? And I think stories have to be told. But there has to be more than just the telling of the story. You just go look at it and get emotionally immersed and then, okay, let's go have something at Papa Haydn's. No. What is the next step? Where's the discussion behind that film? Where's the discussion about what can change what's going on there? When you talk about jobs and job programs, I say, what jobs? Every day I read about how somebody else is going to cut. Put something on the front page, please, about where they're hiring. Because we're playing a game if we think that what we're going to do is have a jobs program with no jobs at the end. We've played that game repeatedly. Time to do something else, folks. We want to take mothers off of welfare? Want to put them to work? Where? Where? Let's quit playing. We're playing, we're in denial, we're playing like we can fix it by not doing anything.
Kathleen Saadat, thank you for being with us today and for helping celebrate our Black history.